Okay, so she's got basically 1,000 years in 60 minutes. I know.
This period is going to be, you have to fasten your seatbelts because St. Augustine, in some of his sermons, used the analogy for the church of the parable that Christ told about the wheat and the weeds. And if you remember, some enemy sowed the weeds into the wheat, and the people working for him said, should we pull up the weeds? And the owner said, no, because you may pull up the weed, and well, it'll be sorted out at the harvest. Well, Augustine says that is also the church, that we have weeds of wheat in the church, and that it will all be sorted out at the last judgment when the sheep are on one side and the goats are on the other. So you might want to keep that in mind as we head into this. One of the first things that we're going to deal with is the Eastern Schism. And this was a conflict between the church in the East and the church in the West. Constantinople, which is present-day Istanbul, was actually a center for Catholicism. And if you think about it, actually the church was born in the East, in the Middle East. And it spread there first before Paul and the Christians went to Rome, and then Peter and Paul went there. And there were some theological issues there, and there was also some big egos involved in it. And it was a role in the Eastern Church. They have icons instead of statues. And the other thing is you get emperors that are meddling in the affairs too, and it just gets a little bit crazy. And the split occurred in 1054. And this is when the Greek Orthodox Church began. And we do have an Eastern Rite Church in the church. It's the liturgies are mostly in Greek, and they're still in full communion with the Catholic Church, full communion with Rome. The Greek Orthodox Church, and the big one is the Russian Orthodox Church, and they are not in union with the Pope. And it was one of Pope St. John Paul II's wish that they would actually come back into the fold, and there have been theological talks and things that they've been ironing out, and maybe one day we'll see that schism actually come to an end. Another thing that's going to happen in 1095, we talked about the Muslims and their reverence for Jerusalem. And they actually took over Jerusalem and would not allow any Christian pilgrims to go into Jerusalem. And so the Pope, Urban II, thought this is not something that we really need to tolerate. We need to do something about it. So he actually is going to come up with, at a ecumenical council, is going to call for a crusade to wrest back the Muslim control of the Holy Land. And he saw it as a spiritual endeavor, so people could go and walk in the footsteps of Christ. And he had to call upon the knights and the lords and kings at that time. And at any time you get, you had basically mixed motives here. I think the Pope really was sincere about the spiritual aspects of it, but you also, some of the Crusaders saw this as a way to get their own land. And so you get some atrocities that occur. They're going to attack places that shouldn't have been attacked and things of this sort. So you get mixed motives, and finally a truce was maintained where Christians could actually go on pilgrimage to the Holy Land as long as they wore the Jerusalem cross. Pilgrimage they just had a symbol of where they were going. If they were going to Compostela in Spain, they wore a shell. And if they were going to Jerusalem, they wore the Jerusalem cross. And this, there are times when the truth did hold and things of this sort. If you want to read more about the Crusades, I could recommend Dr. Thomas Madden. He's probably one of the best experts on the Crusades. He's a professor, I don't know if he's retired, he's a professor at St. Louis University, and he is pretty much an expert. Now, religious orders are going to undergo some renewal. The Benedictine order, in the Benedictine order, what happens is that they want to get stricter, and unfortunately, the Benedictines were becoming rather rich, and abbots were living like lords, and things of this sort. So there was a group that decided they wanted the strict observance, so they're still Benedictines, but they're going to break off. And one of the ones involved, but he actually entered the strict observance, was Bernard of Clairvaux. And then they're going to, periodically they split, till we get the Trappists, who are Benedictines of the strict observance. And like I said, when we talked about Benedict, that was the only variety of religious life we had, until God raised up two men. And I'll admit, I have a bias here, but we'll work on it. Francis and Dominic. Francis was very flamboyant. His father was a merchant in cloth, and once Francis heard the call of Christ saying, you know, rebuild my church. And first of all, he thought it was, you know, really bad, because the church he was in, Sandan Young, was falling apart. And then God made him understand that he was talking about helping to rebuild the church from heresies. And he's going about doing that in poverty. He wants to imitate the absolute poverty of Christ. And like I said, he was very flamboyant, and he actually didn't really understand that this was not the best thing to do. But he took his, he was sent to take some cloth to a merchant, and he sold the cloth, but then he ran into some beggars and gave the beggars the money. And his father was not very pleased with this. And then Francis is still saying that he wants to, you know, follow the poor clients. So they come to a showdown in the town square at Assisi, where he is now saying that, you know, he is not going to follow in the footsteps of his father. He was the only son. And the bishop's there and his father's there. So Francis, in a very flamboyant way, takes off his clothes and says, I don't have any father but God, and I'm going to follow him. And if you can just imagine, the father's yelling at the bishop, stop him, and the bishop's saying, well, I can't really do that, and the person that won is Francis. And so he's going around with basically like burlap or a sack and a cord, barefooted, and he was not even a deacon, but he could preach to people in the town squares and places like that about morals. And there were some very virulent heresy going around at the time, Catholicism. And it was a Gnosticism, and it was pervading. And what was bad about it was that they were saying that the true church is poor, but yet you had bishops and abbots living like kings and lords, and there was a disconnect here. So Francis is trying to, and so the people were following the heretics. And so Francis is able to speak to the common people and explain to them why those heretics were heretics, and that they needed to follow Christ and go back to church and things like that. Francis never, ever wanted to form an order. He was astounded by the fact that he had all these followers all of a sudden. And this causes some problems, because he finally had to, you know, write a rule and get approval. And he did something, though, in the rule that has caused problems for the Franciscans, even today. In his last testament, he said, no one can interpret the rule. And that's going to be a big problem, and that's why Franciscans, when they reform, they have to break off and form another type of Franciscans. You have the Capuchins, you have the CFRs, you have lots of them that are Franciscans claiming to be with the charism. Now, about 2 years before he died, Francis told the brother who was with him, I'm going up to this mountain, Mount Alverna, and I'm going to pray and fast, and don't you dare come up there. You stay down here till I come down. And the brother did that, and Francis, while he was there in prayer, received the stigmata. And what that is the wounds of Christ on his hands and his feet and his side. And it was visible. And he came down from Mount Alverna and went about with the brother. And then shortly after that, he became sick and died. He's the first person in the church to actually receive the stigmata. And he's only one of 2 males who've ever received it. The other one is Padre Pio, that we know of. They're women saints who have received it, some of whom it wasn't visible to after they died. And it's a means of uniting themselves really physically with the sufferings of Christ. Also, Francis had, before Adam and Eve messed up and listened to the snake and ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, everything was in harmony. All of creation was in harmony. And after the fall, creation is no longer in harmony. And but God sends some people who show us what it would have been like. And Francis is one of those. So those stories you hear about Francis, about talking to the birds, negotiating with the wolf to quit attacking the people's sheep, and things like that, those aren't as far-fetched as people want to say they are. They're stories that have been handed down in the same form since the Middle Ages, which tells you there's some truth to it. And I do think that Francis, in his very simple way, is showing us a glimpse of what it was like to be in harmony with all of creation. Now, he's taking care of the common folk, and then my founder, St. Dominic, who is not as well known, he is not in everybody's bird bath. You're not even going to find him in a bird bath. He's from Spain, and he and his bishop had to travel up into southern France, and they actually came in contact with the Cathars, and they also realized that the bishop was, and they met some legates from the Pope. These are like delegates that are representing the Pope, who were there in all their pomp and splendor because they were representing the Pope. And Dominic and his bishop said, we've kind of got to beat them at their own acts, sort of. So it was like, okay, they're saying that these types of things don't lead to God. Then we need to show them why a follower of Christ is going to deny himself for the right reasons and why he's going to live a simple life. And that's what they started doing. Now, Dominic was very well educated. He had gone to the University of Valencia. And they realized that actually there was a system of like seminaries with the Cathars. And so they were going to have to debate with the intellectuals. So you've got Francis talking to the common people, and you have Dominic and then his followers actually talking to the intellectuals and really beating them at their game, just showing all of the holes that are in there. And so once the Dominican order was founded, Dominic sent the early friars to the university towns to get the advanced degrees and also to educate the people who were in that intellectual level so that they could see the errors of that. So it's a beautiful way of looking at it because God is going to, in his wisdom, is taking care of the church. He's taking care of the common folk, but he's also taking care of the people that are studying the theology and the philosophy. Also at this time, we also have some great theologians that are going to emerge in the High Middle Ages. One of them is Albert the Great, but both of them have to be Dominicans. And he saw the use of Aristotle. Up until this time, Plato was the philosophy that was used to explain theological terms. It wasn't quite a good fit. And Albert realized that Aristotelian language was a better fit. And if you look at the Catechism, we're still using the language of Albert and his student, Thomas Aquinas, for explaining doctrine, that a sacrament is an outward sign instituted by Christ to give grace. Those are all Aristotelian, the bases are Aristotelian terms that we've been using down since the High Middle Ages to explain things. And so the church is now getting a better philosophical language, which is going to help in explaining doctrine and things like that, because we're also going to get into the whole thing about with the reformers. The Franciscans did produce St. Bonaventure, and St. Bonaventure takes a little different turn. Albert and Thomas are going to emphasize in man his intellect and his will, and virtue and will. Bonaventure is not going to deny that, but he's going to emphasize more the love of God, and that if we truly love God, then we're not going to want to sin. And so his writings, while they are very good specimens of scholastic literature, are not as detailed on the virtues and things like that of Thomas and Albert. Then we begin to get a scandal that's going to lead to a really big scandal. In Rome, after about 450, when you had the migration of all of the Slavic people and Germanic people coming in to the Roman Empire, because the capital of Rome had been moved, capital of the whole Roman Empire had been moved to Constantinople, Rome was really like almost a backwater town. It was not well governed on a municipality level. They were not keeping up the roads and things like this. So most people are not living there. The Pope is still living there. And it became, you also had groups of people that actually today, I guess we call them like gangsters, that would come in and kind of take things. And so the French monarch convinced the Pope that it was really dangerous to be living in Rome, and the papacy had a piece of real estate in France that actually belonged to them, and it's Avignon, but it's in the middle of France, it's in France, and so the French monarch said, come to Avignon, we'll be able to protect you, and things will be okay. So the Pope moved to Avignon, and I think, maybe they thought this would be a stopgap measure, but things are really nice there. And so they had a palace, and they added on to the palace. All of the cardinals that were helpers were there, and it lasted from 305 to 376, 70 years, when the Pope, who's the Bishop of Rome, is residing, for all intents and purposes, in France. And this was considered a really big scandal. But, and of course, they started electing French popes, and no French pope was going to go back to Rome. They thought it was dangerous. And I always like to think it took 2 women to get the Pope to go back to Rome. One of them was Catherine of Siena, who was a Dominican tertiary. And what that is that she was not in a Dominican convent. She wasn't a nun, but they had lay women who actually followed the rule of St. Dominic, and they either lived in their own homes, or if they were widows, they may live together, and they were responsible for the charity in the city of Siena and things of this sort. And God called Catherine to actually get mixed up in this affair. Now, she was not real excited about it at first, but her confessor told her, yeah, that's probably what God wants you to do. So she starts writing letters to the Pope, telling him in a very strong but respectful way that his place was in Rome. And he actually used the term Babbo, and that's an Italian word for daddy. It was interesting, we have a sister who is from Bologna, and I teach Apostles Church history, and I have her read some of the letters, and she said, that's what I call my father. She was surprised, and giving him all the reasons why he needed to go back. And then he got a little bit more pressure from Bridget of Sweden. She was a queen, and her husband had died, and she heard that, she had set up hospitals in Sweden, and she had heard that they had really no hospitals for the poor in Rome. So she goes to Rome and starts setting them up, and she realizes this is it. She also had some revelations from God saying the Pope needs to be back here. So she's sending letters. And so he's getting hit, he's double teamed here. So he eventually goes back, and he dies a year after he is elected, goes back to Rome. So they need to elect another Pope. And prior to having cardinals vote for the Pope, the men of Rome were the ones who voted for the Pope because he's a bishop of Rome. They never got used to that idea initially of the cardinals doing it. And so when they went into the conclave, which is when they're secreted away to go ahead and vote for the Pope, the Italian mob was yelling, we want a Roman Pope. We want a Roman Pope. They didn't elect a Roman Pope, but they did elect an Italian Pope. And that seemed to calm things down. But unfortunately, the men didn't have any diplomatic skills. And you know, if you've ever been in a situation where there are things going on that need to be changed, you don't do it all at once, and you certainly don't do it with a sledgehammer. You have to be diplomatic about it, and he wasn't. So what happened was that he really came out against the French cardinals, and so they said, this was an invalid election. We were coerced to vote for this man. So they leave Rome and head back and elect their own pope and head back to Avignon. So we have two popes, and they're having their own sets of cardinals. And, you know, it could have ended with their deaths, but it never did. So when one died, the other group would elect one. When the other one died, they would elect him. It was getting perpetuated. Now, to be clear, the Pope elected in Rome was validly elected. And that is where the apostolic succession goes through. These other men are anti-popes. And then the church calls a council in Pisa, trying to say, okay, we got to figure this thing out. And nobody could come up with anything, so they elected another pope. So we have three popes at one point. One in Rome, one in Avignon, and one in Pisa. And some of the other things that get mixed up with this is that then the monarchs are starting to take sides. So of course, if France is going to back the French Pope, then England's going to back the Roman Pope. You know, they're not going to be on the same side. So you had some of this and the jockeying for power in people at that time. Now, most people didn't know about this. Just remember, we don't have 24/7 news. We don't have the internet. We don't have cell phones. So a lot of people didn't know that this was going on. If you were out in the boondocks in your little parish, even the priest probably didn't know. And but it was actually a scandal. So they called the Council of Constance, and it was legitimately called, and the Roman Pope and the Avignon Pope resigned. The Pisa Pope didn't exactly want to, but he was forced to. And they didn't kill him or anything. died a natural death. And in 1415, they ended it. And the Roman line is valid, but the schism did some real damage to the reputation of the church and papal power. Now, we're getting into the Renaissance, and especially in Italy, the city-states are vying to outdo each other. This is the time when you've got, Michelangelo, Raphael, Bernini, and all these people running around painting, Leonardo da Vinci, painting and doing sculptures. And so it's really nice. And monarchs are trying to show their power by the types of buildings they're building. So unfortunately, the Renaissance popes get into that. And so they're more concerned about getting their power and displaying their power than they really are about the church. One thing, though, is, and this shows that we are a divine institution guided by the Holy Spirit, because we would have imploded at this time. None of these popes did anything anywhere near changing any doctrine. They were more concerned about, tearing down the St. Peter's that Constantine had built and building the St. Peter's that we know today. And so, unfortunately, it costs money to do all this. And so they resorted to ways of getting money that are not really a good idea. First of all, they would sell offices. And the way that things worked at this time in history, the oldest male inherited everything. And so you had to find something, if you had a lot of boys, for them to do. And usually one would be going into the priesthood. And if you were, kind of rich, you would want them to have a nice bishopric. So, I've got a couple boys, and one of them needs to get in the church, but I want to, archbishop somewhere. But he's only 14. So money can be swapped around, and he can get the position. And this is called simony. Another thing was, I've been married 4 times, and women were pawns with the nobility. But yet, this is a better marriage. So my father wants me to be married to this person, because if I'm married to him, he'll quit attacking the country. And so what you do is, for the right amount of money, I can get a dispensation from canon law. So they were selling dispensation. Also, if my kid's 14, you're going to have a dispensation in addition to buying the office. They also sold indulgences. Now, indulgences are, it's all of the merits of Christ's passion were given to the church. And by the merits of that, the church can offer this means of grace to us. And these are called indulgences. When we sin, we have the sin, but we also have the temporal punishment that goes with it. So when you go to confession, your sin is forgiven. You don't have to worry about that. It's forgiven. But we still owe some kind of reparation, if you will, for sinning, and that's called the temporal punishment. That's why a priest gives you a penance. I explained it to middle school kids, like if I went out and fell in a mud hole dressed like this, I could get the mud off, but I have to scrub the stains out. And so the temporal punishment is like the stain that has, and we have to be totally, absolutely pure before we can come before the face of God, or we can't stand it. So the church has attached indulgences to certain things. Stations of the cross at this time of the year are an indulgence. Saying the rosary in front of the Blessed Sacrament has an indulgence attached to it. And periodically, there are other things that have indulgences with them. And I'm sure we're going to, as the Eucharistic revival gets more underway, we'll be having more opportunities to gain indulgences. You have to, it's not automatic. You have to pray for the Pope. You have to be not attached to sin, which means within the week, within the week or 2 weeks, you need to go to confession and receive Holy Communion. And then you get it. The neat thing I like about indulgences also is that you can apply them to other people. So you can apply them to the souls in purgatory. And we don't definitely know if somebody is in heaven or purgatory, but you can pray for them. And I'm here to tell you, pray for the poor souls in purgatory, and they're very good alarm clocks. They get me up when I need to get up. That's a grace that we have. Another thing, and we talked about this with Polycarp, it happened, and that's a good confirmation name, anybody, they saved his bones as relics, because this is a man who gave his life in witness to Christ. And so the church does venerate the relics of saints. They're not rabbit's feet, and it's not, lucky piece, but you're venerating and praying to the saint who has them. I think, was it last year, Padre Pio, some of his relics were here. And so you get opportunities to venerate the relic and pray to the person that was there. Now, unfortunately, they were selling indulgences and selling relics. I'm sure during this period of time, there were an awful lot of chicken bones running around. And if you remember Chaucer and the Pardoner's Tale, that's what he's talking about with the relics. That's what the guy is doing. Some of these things need to be corrected. And we had 2 ways of doing it. And this leads us into the Reformation. And there are actually 2 Reformations. There's the Protestant Reformation, and there is a Catholic Reformation. The church realized that things needed to be done. It's how it was done at the time. And one of the people that actually happened to be a Dominican was in the area selling relics. But Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk, and the man suffered from scruples. And what that means is that he was always afraid that he was never really forgiven, or that his prayer wasn't good enough, or types of things. And until he said he read in St. Paul's and had an epiphany about that it's through faith that we're saved. Now, I always tell the apostle, if you're going to be a heretic, you get to pick and choose what you want out of the Bible. He obviously left off James that said, faith without works is dead. And in 1517, he posted 95 theses on the door of the Wittenberg church. It was a university church. And what this was is that professors would post disputation topics that would be argued by the graduate students with the professor there, and then the professor would actually synthesize it and come up with the right answer. Now, 95 is a little excessive. If you have read through him, he was right on some points, and he was out in left field on other points. And the other thing, that Germany had a high literacy rate, and the printing press had been developed. He wrote these in Latin, but they were quickly translated into German and circulated. It might have been a university thing that could have been settled if it hadn't gotten out, and you started here again, getting the princes in Germany taking sides. Eventually, and he's going to argue that if it's not in Scripture, it's not doctrine. So he's throwing out the fathers of the church and sacred tradition. And it's the sola scriptura. It's not found in the Scripture. So out goes all the sacraments except 2, because you've got baptism and the Eucharist. And then that's going to get watered down with him and the other ones that go around. And then eventually he is going to be excommunicated. And in Germany, they had electors that would come together to make some general laws for the whole Germany. Germany was not united yet. And so the electors came together and protested the action of the Pope. And that's why they're called Protestants. because they protested. And this is going to spread throughout Germany. Another one, now Luther really never actually was trying to form another religion. He was trying to reform the Catholic Church. He goes about it in the wrong way. It's going to be his followers, because Luther was a scripture scholar. He was not a systematic theologian. It's going to take some of his followers and actually put it into a systematic theology. Another one who did develop a systematic theology is John Calvin, and he's in Geneva. He was originally from France, and he is going to also emphasize sola scriptura. And he's also going to preach predestination. And his version of it was that when we were created, God, and his God was the God of the Old Testament, who was a vengeful God, not the personal God that we know through Christ. And he is going to say that we're predestined to either go to heaven or hell. And there's not a whole lot we can do about it. But we don't know. So it's better to live what he would call a godly life in order to do it. So Geneva had very strict regulations. My favorite was that every tavern had to have a Bible. I don't know how many times they were read. And just different things like that. Another one was, you know what a baker's dozen is? Okay. That originated in Geneva because there were people that went around checking on the trades, and you know how easy it is when you're counting stuff out to lose count. And if a baker failed to give 12 pieces of bread, or rolls or something, then his shop would be shut down. So they got in the process of just adding an extra one in there just to take care of it. And Calvin and his followers are also Protestants. Calvinism was actually the form that the Puritans had. And if you think of what the strict regulations in the New England colonies, Massachusetts Bay and all of those, that's Calvinist influence. Another one who is not actually into this type of thing is Henry VIII. And Deacon Mike mentioned Thomas More. Henry VIII, at that time, you had to have a male heir. His father had fought really hard to get the Tudor dynasty started. And Henry was married to Catherine of Aragon, who was the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand. And she had a daughter, but the other children, most of whom were males, were stillborn. And so Henry's getting desperate. He has to have a legitimate male heir. So he wants to annul the marriage to her. And the Pope says, no, you can't do that. And it is going back and forth, and he's getting desperate. And he also falls in love with a courtier by the name of Anne Boleyn, who convinces him that she can have a boy. And so, because of this, Henry declares himself the supreme head of the Church of England. And people had to sign an oath, and Thomas More refused to sign the oath. And only one bishop out of all the English bishops refused to sign it, and that was John Fisher. And they were both beheaded. If you've never seen it, The Man for All Seasons is about the life of Thomas More. It took all the Academy Awards in 1966. We watch it in church history, and I tell us the postulates. This isn't an action movie, all the drama's in the dialogue. But it's a really powerful movie. Eventually, Anne Boleyn has a daughter, who's Elizabeth I. He has another wife who actually has a son, but he doesn't live out of his teenage years. So it's under Edward VI and Elizabeth that the Church of England starts veering away from the Roman Catholic Church. And apostolic succession is broken, and they start changing things, and it's not technically a Protestant church. It's a non-Catholic church. And some Anglicans will tell you today they're not Protestants. And I mean, strictly speaking, they're not. So you've got this going on, and it's separating peoples. You know, and also Henry was determined that Lutheranism was not going to get into England. And then you had the French monarchs who really didn't want it to come into France. So what happened is that we get the Catholic Reformation. The church did realize that, yeah, we do need to reform. And God is going to raise up some powerful people to do this. One of these is Ignatius of Loyola, who's a former military person from the Basque region of Spain. And he has a conversion after he's been hit in the leg with a cannonball. And he goes to a cave, and that's when he writes his spiritual exercises, which is a 30-day meditation on the life of Christ. And then he comes out and, first of all, he wants to be a priest, but he has to go get the education. Young men started college, the universities at the age of 14 to master the liberal arts. And I had to hand it to Ignatius. He started at the University of Paris and sat on the same benches with the 14-year-olds. Now, of course, he moved faster than they did. And he had, one of his roommates was Francis Xavier, who lived a really nice life. He was a nobility. And Ignatius finally converts him. He said it was the hardest convert he'd ever made. And so Ignatius and Francis Xavier and then Peter Faber are the three, and they get 12 other companions, and they take their vows, and then they take a vow where the Pope is their superior, although they do have a general superior. And what Ignatius did was that he sent some of the early Jesuits to, like, Germany and Switzerland and places like that to argue with the Protestants. But first, they had to learn what Lutheranism taught and what Calvinism taught. It was said that some of the Jesuits were better Lutherans than the Lutherans. And also, he sent missionaries out. Francis Xavier is the one responsible for going to India. And he goes to Japan, and he died on his way to China. He makes lots of converts, but they also realized that they need to learn the language and the culture. So the Jesuits going into missionary lands have to know the language and the culture. The ones that Isaac Jogues and Jean de Brébeuf up in northern New York and Canada with the Huron and the Mohawk Indians, they were martyred. But they actually left writings about the culture and the language, and actually John de Brébeuf actually did a catechism in the Huron language. So we get saints that are coming up to witness to what the church teaches. Some of the other ones you've probably heard of is Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. They're Carmelites in Spain, and they're going to give us the language for mystical theology. Mystical theology is the soul's relationship to God. And it's not precise like doctrinal theology, so it's kind of hard to explain it, but they gave us a language for that, which was very good. Also, Vincent de Paul, he started the orphanages and helping the poor, and we still have the St. Vincent de Paul societies, although he didn't found those. And he founded the Daughters of Charity. And those were the sisters that had St. Thomas Hospital with the big hats. So we get lots of saints that come up during this time to witness to the holiness of the church. Then we get into the modern age, and it gets, you know, if you think that was wild, it gets even wilder because we're beginning to get a confluence of science, technology, and philosophy, and there's a reliance on reason alone. So if I can't reason through it, and in some instances, if I can't see it and touch it, it doesn't exist. So, I mean, we haven't touched your soul. And like, when's the last time you saw human nature walk into a room? So they're concepts that you just can't pin down with a nominalist approach and a materialistic approach. And so, and also we begin to get the exclusion of religion in the public life. The big example of this is the French Revolution. And it abolished religion, it set up its own religion of reason, and had a totally secular society. And what happened was that the way it devolved into the Reign of Terror scared people, but some of the things stuck, like the secularizing of society and things like this. So this started back in 1789. We're dealing with that today. We get people that say, I can't force my beliefs on somebody else, type of thing. And then you start getting these types of things getting into mainstream Catholic thought, and then actually without bishops and popes who were very vigilant, it was seeping into some theology at this time. And so it's going to erode people's faith in the church. And also at this time, you start getting people that are doing very good research on the archaeological places in the Holy Land, and finding out that maybe this was not exactly the place where this particular miracle occurred for very good reasons. They weren't trying to shake people's faith, they were trying to give more context. But what's happening is that type of stuff was getting out into the mainstream, being misinterpreted, and a lot of those scholars were silenced. And to their credit, they did accept that. They were just ahead of their times. And they were also finding the new manuscripts that had been lost and could make better translations. Then we get the Industrial Revolution hits all over the world, and you get people just become cogs in a factory. You think about it in the United States, you had women who were sewing who were locked into a room, and we had the problem when the warehouse burned and they lost all of their lives because they couldn't get out. You had little children working because families had to do that. And so this was all over, this type of progress in anything that you could do. And so the church starts to challenge some of this by emphasizing the dignity of the human person. And one of the popes that speaks out against this is Leo XIII, and he writes the first encyclical, Rerum Novarum, about that these types of things are against the teachings of Christ, and that it's not just. And he actually argued in there that the family was a basic unit of society, and people needed to be paid a family wage, and children needed to go to school. And what he started was, from then on, the popes have issued social justice encyclicals at intervals that are hitting on the problems of society today. And Pope John Paul II wrote numerous ones on social justice, and the church is teaching on certain things. It's important to actually know that. The church did come up with the compendium of the social teachings of the Catholic Church, and it combines all of the encyclicals and what the teaching is. It's indexed, it's about this thick, but it's a very good resource for people that are interested in that. Then in 1914, World War I broke out. And one of at Aquinas, the history majors had to do a senior thesis. And I was asking one of the guys what he was doing. He's doing the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I, and the aftermath. And he was saying, he said, I'm just not quite sure how we got to Czech killing and in Serbia killing the Archduke of Austria, how that ended up in a world war, or how the United States ended up in that. And I said, that's a good question. But during the war, because it broke out into sides, and The Pope at the time, Benedict XV, maintained strict neutrality. He always said that the church was there to help the victims of the war. And he actually sent priests into the prison camps because he said families had a right to know if their sons or their husbands were alive. And had these priests, and I'm sure there were some secretaries that wrote letters to the families, and then they made sure that letters got back to them. Unfortunately, Benedict XIV was refused. He asked to have an observer at the Treaty of Versailles, and he was refused, actually by the Allies. And we know from history that they were out for vengeance, and it just really fueled what actually is going to end up into being World War II. Things happened in that, and of course we get Nazism with scientific racism. That with this myth that the perfect German was blonde hair, blue eyes, was Aryan, came from the northern regions of Germany, and that the whole population had been polluted by the Jews. And also we had people who had disabilities, and they really should not be allowed to live because they might reproduce those disabilities. So you get out with the atrocities of the Jews. Pius XI, he was getting the reports back, and Pius XI actually wrote the only encyclical that's been written in German. And it was in that encyclical that he denounced Nazism. And it's also when he said that actually, spiritually, we're all Jewish, and a solidarity with them. And then you get all of the things with when Pius XII comes in and saying that he didn't do anything and that type of thing. First of all, archives, even in the United States, are like presidential archives are usually sealed for 50 years. They're not open to scholars because people might still be alive that are involved in that. So the Vatican does the same thing. They've now fully opened the archives because we're 50 years out of Pius XII, and they're finding out he did a lot more than people say he did. All the convents and monasteries and churches were asked to house Jews and Allied soldiers when they got in there. And things you have to remember, first, the church is not a political monolith. And secondly, there's no enforcement of the policies if they were political. And the Pope saw that in Belgium, when the bishops rose up against the atrocities of the Germans, they rounded up lots of people, one of whom was Edith Stein and her sister. And so they knew that it was risky to speak out directly against it, but there were undercover ways of doing it. Like pamphlets were sent in by bicycle riders into some parts of Europe. So you get all of this going on and just a furor of that. Hopefully things will settle down a little bit about what the church did. But, it's one of the, Father Vidmar says, what was the Pope going to do, send in the Swiss Guards? I mean, he doesn't have an army, so you can't enforce it. Then Vatican II came in 1962. John the 23rd was elected as a placeholder Pope, and nobody knew that, a few months after he was elected, that he calls his council. It's not a doctrinal council. It's simply to get the church up to date. He's not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I think part of the problem with Vatican II was the implementation. It was very rocky, to say the least. And the understanding of the documents. A lot of people didn't read the documents, but thought they knew what they said. We're still getting some backlashes from this. Dr. Schreck is probably the expert if you read anything on Vatican II from him. But we also got some things that are accomplishments. RCIA is one of them. That was reestablished as the rite for Christian initiation, which is actually what the early Christians used. And the time frame's the same. We also, read to emphasize the fact that bishops are the chief teachers in their dioceses. But they have to be in union with the Pope. So Bishop Spalding can't teach anything that's opposed to the teachings of the Pope, or he shouldn't be doing that. Then you get more involvement of lay people in the church. The permanent diaconate was reestablished in the church, and we had a more, in a sense, sympathetic and reasoned approach to separated brethren. More dialogues have occurred with them. And then we have John Paul I, who was only in office about 30 days. And he did die of a heart attack. It was not a conspiracy. And then we get into, I think we've been spoiled when we look at history because we have had saintly popes. John the 23rd is a saint, Pope John Paul II is a saint, and he's the one that actually is said to have started really 3 revolutions. He was instrumental behind the scenes in the end of communism in Europe, with the taking down of the Berlin Wall in 1989. He did lots of canonizations, and he was intentional. He wanted to canonize people from every culture and every lifestyle. That saints are not people dressed like me or like Father. That we're all called to be saints, and we've got examples out there. And so he's doing that, and then his travel. Probably everybody had seen him at one point. And the other thing that he started, which people said is not going to work, were World Youth Days. And those have been game changers for kids. Pope Benedict kept it up, and Pope Francis is also keeping them up. I think one thing Pope John Paul II showed us how to do is to accept suffering and die gracefully. And then I think with Pope Benedict, he was trying to actually attack the relativism in the culture. You know, my morality is not your morality type of thing. He's the Pope since Celestine, who resigned. And because of that, he said because he could not keep up with the with everything that was needed. Actually, his doctor told him he couldn't travel anymore. And I think Pope Benedict has showed us how to retire gracefully. And he said that his job was to pray for the church. And we just recently had his death. And then we have Pope Francis, who is the first Latin American to be elected Pope. He's the first Pope who has no connection with Europe. He's always been, if you want to call Argentina a democracy, it's been kind of rocky. So that explains why sometimes he doesn't have a lot of patience for all the pomp and circumstance around the Vatican, because they're held over from how royal courts operated. And so he's streamlined a lot of that kind of stuff. And, you know, he's been a voice for people who are suffering. You know, he's certainly been a voice against any type of conflict which is going to involve innocent people getting hurt. Actually, he's the first time a Pope's ever actually gone to an embassy and said, you need to stop this war. After the Russians invaded the Ukraine, he went to the Russian embassy in Rome and lodged a complaint. It obviously didn't do a whole lot of good. He's also said that if the conditions are right, he has no problem with going to the Ukraine. And I don't think he does. And then we've seen John the 23rd has been canonized, Paul VI has been canonized, and John Paul II had been canonized. John Paul I, they do have a miracle for him, so he may be beatified sometime soon. And we'll just have to, you know, you have to be dead a while before they're going to canonize you. So we'll have to wait for some of the other ones. Does it, and this was fast, you know, it was like taking a helicopter and did some diving, but we didn't really do any deep diving. Does anybody have any questions either from last week or this week? Are you totally confused? Yes, sir.
Just maybe a silly question. Why is it called a mother house if it's full of sisters?
Oh, that's just a term for where the major superior lives, her sisters. And so we call our highest superior mother. And so that's what that is. And she has to live there with her counselors.
Okay. Are they also sisters, or?
Pardon me?
Are those counselors also sisters, or are they other individuals?
What do you mean, at the mother house?
You said the mother.
Oh, the counselors are other sisters. In the Dominican order, we elect our officials. So they're elected. Y'all want to come out there and give me a call? I can give a tour. It's a pretty neat place. It was built in 1862.
We're scheduled for a
Oh,
while.
you was good. And then we're still using the parts that were built in 1862. So. We did update it. We finally got air conditioning. Well, thank y'all for listening. I appreciate it.